Every now and then, a stupid article like this or this will surface and entirely sweep over the complexities and nuance of Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein. In fact, these barely qualify as articles. This one is basically the synopsis of a college literature module that reads as though it's been cribbed from the course outline, and this one is a series of sentences strung together with out-of-context quotes from academics. It's the headlines that do pretty much all the legwork here, and, of course, if you've read Frankenstein, you'll know that these headlines are gross oversimplifications of one of the world's most well-studied, well-adapted, and well-known novels. Now, these articles are stupid. Don't read them. But the issues they're incompetently scrabbling at are very, very interesting. What about the presentation of race in Frankenstein? Who is the victim in the bloody power struggle between Victor and his creature? Considering these questions, as this video will do, opens the door to further inquiry. How does Mary Shelley write the other? How are marginalised groups and individuals represented in the novel? And, perhaps most importantly, what can Frankenstein, a text written at a time when phrenology was all the rage, when debates thundered in and out of UK Parliament over the slave trade and slavery, and when women in England had virtually no rights and did not legally exist, teach us today about how we, as people, should treat one another? Or, to put it simply, what can Frankenstein teach us about prejudice? But before we get into all that, hello, I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe. This is my creature, Mousy the cat, and we make videos on all things bookish, so please subscribe if that's your jam. Also, be sure to click the bell to be notified when our videos come out. We don't really post too often, so turning on notifications means that you won't miss out if the algorithm does us dirty. A huge thank you to our wonderful patrons over on Patreon for supporting us in making our videos. Feel free to join up if you have the desire and the financial means, of course. I'll put a link in the description. I want to extend special thanks to Dr. Mary Going, who worked as a script consultant for this video, and who is one half of The Ghoul Guides, a digital multimedia project devoted to exploring, understanding, and enjoying the wonders and weirdness of the Gothic. And who are you kidding? You love the wonders and weirdness of the Gothic, so go and subscribe and watch all of their stuff. I'll put a link down below. And finally, before we get started, please be aware that this video will discuss issues related to sexism, racism, and sexual abuse. Now, let's get stuck into this exploration of Frankenstein, victimhood, and the other, and start with a question that has kept scholars up night after night, candle after candle. Is Frankenstein feminist? In my travels of late, I've seen a lot of articles with headlines like, "Poor Things, a feminist Frankenstein odyssey." "Poor Things is a clever feminist reimagining of Mary Shelley's Gothic classic Frankenstein. It's a fantastical feminist spin on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a feminist-infused take on the Frankenstein story." Essentially, it's Frankenstein, but feminist. And Poor Things isn't the only feminist take on Frankenstein to grace our screens of late. Films like Lisa Frankenstein and Birth Rebirth also provide us with a female-centred take on Shelley's beloved classic. But kids, I'm here to tell you that Frankenstein itself, written by a teenage Mary Shelley and published over 200 years ago, was already feminist. Well, proto-feminist, because the concept of feminism as we understand it today, and indeed the word feminism, didn't exist back then. To call Poor Things a feminist Frankenstein suggests that the actual Frankenstein wasn't especially concerned with women's rights, struggles, or emancipation. But Shelley's novel is actually an incredibly astute depiction of women's suffering. Now, I'm not going to be weighing in on the heated debate over whether Poor Things is feminist or a masterclass in the male gaze. This article seems to sum up a range of very different opinions, and there's plenty of content flying around that deals with this topic in detail. This video is about Frankenstein, the novel by Mary Shelley that undoubtedly inspired the novel Poor Things by Alistair Gray, that inspired this recent and rather divisive depiction of reanimation. There's a reason Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is so inspiring, and ranks as one of the most enduringly influential, well-adapted, and well-studied novels out there. And I think it has to do with Shelley's brilliant exposé of the other, that makes us reflect on our very human tendency to scapegoat and other those who don't fit in. And this raises a whole lot of questions about everything, from patriarchy to slavery. In case you need a refresher, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, to use the novel's full title, is the story of Victor Frankenstein, who builds a creature, that's a humanoid being, out of dead human and animal body parts and brings him to life. Oh, and just a quick side note, my analysis in this video is of the 1818 version of the novel. Shelley changed quite a few crucial details in the 1831 edition, so just bear in mind that this will be an analysis of the original. Anyway, despite his toil, Victor is horrified by what he has created. His creature then escapes and ends up committing a slew of violent crimes. Victor essentially spends the novel searching for his creature, bargaining with him, cursing himself, lamenting his sorry state, and refusing to show any kind of compassion to this being that he's created who is unable to fit into society. The story is mostly told from Victor's perspective, but sandwiched in the middle of the book, we have the creature's own first-person account of his experiences. He recounts his time spent living in a small hovel next to the home of the de Lacy family, learning from them by watching them in secret. During his time there, he learned to read, speak, and, most importantly, he learned compassion. He loves the de Lacy family, so one day he reveals himself to them. But they, like Victor, are horrified by his appearance and can't accept him. He is incredibly hurt by this. His desire for integration and human companionship is thwarted, so he finds Victor and demands that Victor make for him a female companion, also constructed out of body parts, to alleviate his loneliness. Victor initially agrees to this, but then changes his mind. The creature finds out, promises revenge, makes good on this promise, and kills Victor's new bride Elizabeth on their wedding night before escaping to the North Pole with Victor hot on his tail. The novel concludes, spoilers, with Victor killed by the creature and the creature borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. The story is told through 3 different male narrative perspectives, and the way these narratives are structured is interesting and important. The novel begins and ends from the perspective of Robert Walton, a North Pole explorer whose ship is stuck in the ice. While he's vainly awaiting a thaw, Walton finds the near-dead Victor, who recounts his tale, which Walton then communicates to his sister in letters. So within Walton's narrative, we have Victor's narrative, and within Victor's, smushed right in the middle, we have the creatures. Literally trapped between the other narrative voices at play, the creature's voice is isolated, othering him further, throwing up questions about narrative reliability and reinforcing his total disenfranchisement. Even the way Shelley structures the novel isolates and thoroughly marginalises the other. And this brings us to the feminism of it all. Now, you might read Frankenstein and think, this novel isn't great in terms of female representation. All the women seem kind of passive. And you'd be right. Mary Shelley's female characters largely serve as objects through which the male characters can learn or reflect. Justine Moritz, for example, who is falsely accused of murdering little William Frankenstein, is effectively a plot device that serves the function of intensifying Victor's feelings of guilt. Elizabeth, Victor's bride-to-be, is a means through which the creature can enact his revenge and ruin Victor's life. Many of the women meet grisly and/or tragic ends, and those who don't have minor roles in the narrative. But rather than an oversight on Shelley's part, I would argue this is a deliberate depiction of marginalisation. This isn't a novel filled with powerful, independent, and active female characters. Most of the female characters are passive, certainly in comparison with Victor and the creature. But it's this comparison, starkly made, that matters here. The female characters are sensible, caring, and truthful, and Shelley uses these qualities to make unavoidably blatant the contrast between these women and the novel's main male characters, who show repeated instances of poor judgment, violence, and reckless, self-centered decision-making. So, you can certainly, and justifiably, make the argument that women are powerless in Frankenstein, but you can also make the case that this powerlessness is Shelley's way of clearly distinguishing and showing up the male characters who have far too much power, to their own detriment, and to the detriment of everyone around them. The novel is a power struggle between Victor and the creature, and it ends terribly on all counts. What simultaneously drives and complicates this power struggle? Fear. Fear of your offspring ruining your life, fear of dying alone, fear of your own capacity for evil. And, as Anne K. Mellor argues, fear of female sexuality. One of the deepest horrors of this novel is Frankenstein's implicit goal of creating a society for men only. His creature is male. He refuses to create a female. There is no reason that the race of immortal beings he hoped to propagate should not be exclusively male. This fear of female sexuality is best exemplified through the saga that ensues after Victor agrees to delve back into his repository of body parts and make, for his creature, a female companion. A little context. The creature confronts Victor and says, "I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create." Now, this quote, and in fact this entire storyline, poses some very interesting questions about how the creature has been socialised, where he arrived at his views on women and consent, and how, even though he represents the ultimate other, he retains a form of male privilege. And this has to do with the way he learned about the world while living in the hovel next to the de Lacy family home. Evidently, what he learns leads him to bypass issues of consent. When demanding Victor build him a female companion, he doesn't pause to think, maybe a female companion might not want to be with me, because what he has learned hasn't taught him to value female autonomy. But let's also consider the creature's plight. He has tried to integrate into society, has shown kindness and affection towards the de Lacy family, and has been entirely shunned. He believes no one, other than someone who looks like him, will ever accept him, which I can understand. Victor, his creator, his parent figure, spent literally no time trying to help, teach, or nurture him, and everyone he's tried to connect with has been repulsed and frightened by his appearance. So he decides that running off to the vast wilds of South America with his hideous female companion to subsist on acorns and berries and live together in a way that he assures Victor will be peaceful and human is his best course of action. Victor reluctantly agrees and sets to work. However, while he's sequestered away building his female creature out of more stolen body parts, doubt starts creeping in. As I sat, a train of reflection occurred to me which led me to consider the effects of what I was now doing. 3 years before, I was engaged in the same manner, and had created a fiend whose unparalleled barbarity had desolated my heart and filled it forever with the bitterest remorse. I was now about to form another being, of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight for its own sake in murder and wretchedness. He had sworn to quit the neighbourhood of man and hide himself in deserts, but she had not. And she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with a compact made before her creation. They might even hate each other. The creature who already lived loathed his own deformity, and might he not conceive a greater abhorrence for it when it came before his eyes in the female form? She also might turn with disgust from him to the superior beauty of man. She might quit him, and he be again alone, exasperated by the fresh provocation of being deserted by one of his own species. Lots of interesting stuff to unpick here. So, let's begin with the key question. Why does Victor start doubting himself? Well, broadly speaking, he's thinking back to the creation of his first creature, how negatively that affected him, and this makes him unsure about proceeding. But he also offers some specific reasons for not wanting to go through with his creation of a female creature. She might be 10,000 times more malignant than her mate. She might become a thinking and reasoning animal who doesn't want to move to South America and eat berries with her male counterpart. She might hate him and fancy someone else. She might be too unattractive for him, leading him to loathe her deformity as he loathes his own. And, ultimately, she might decide to leave and strike out on her own. What's especially notable about all this is that Victor doesn't have these doubts when creating his male creature. These thoughts don't even cross his mind. It's only when he's creating a female creature that he frets over her physical appearance, her potential independence and autonomy, her capacity for violence, and her great physical strength. He can risk making a male creature, but he can't risk making a female who would so dramatically outstrip what is expected of a woman. And, as Mellor argues, implicit here is Frankenstein's horror that, given the gigantic strength of this female, she would have the power to seize and even rape the male she might choose. Again, this risk is not something Victor seems especially bothered about when creating his male creature. He speculates further. even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World. Yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the demon thirsted would be children, and a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth, who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. After freaking himself out like this, Victor, trembling with passion, tore to pieces the thing on which I was engaged. This violent destruction, which isn't without its sexual undertones, puts an end to the female creature and her potential to outrank, attack, or leave her male counterpart. I think this whole passage highlights Victor's utter self-absorption, his innate and unabashed proclivity to other those who are dissimilar to himself, and his very literal God complex. He's allowed to create and destroy life at will, but he won't allow his creatures to do the same. Through Victor's internal ruminating and violent action in this passage, Shelley is demonstrating for us this implicit male fear of female sexuality, power, and freedom. But I want to hone in on something else here, and that's Victor's specific fear about the two creatures creating a race of devils propagated upon the earth. Shelley is entering a discourse, very prominent in the early 1800s, about racial identity, superiority, and physical difference. Not only does Victor fear female autonomy, but the propagation of a race he considers other, or, what is, to Victor, an even worse possibility, the mixing of races. As Marie Mulvey-Roberts argues, anxiety over miscegenation, a disused derogatory term referring to reproduction between different racial or ethnic groups, especially between white and non-white people, is one of the reasons why Victor Frankenstein decided to destroy his female creature, fearing that she might procreate with man rather than with her fellow monster. So while there's one argument that goes, Victor makes a sensible decision to stop playing God by destroying his female creature, his specific motives and reasoning belie a fascinating subtext that shows just how involved Frankenstein is with a particularly potent, horrifying, and divisive issue prominent in the early 1800s: slavery. As John Clement Ball tells us, Frankenstein was written at a time when European expansion and rule over darker places and races had long seemed part of the natural order to most Europeans. The historical moment of Frankenstein coincides with the anti-slavery movement. Shelley composed it between the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the emancipation of slaves in 1833. Shelley, it is all but certain, would have been very aware of the debate surrounding the slave trade as it stood in 1818. Not only were these prominent issues of the day, but Shelley's parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, and her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, were all radicals involved in abolitionist causes. So it would be hard, if not impossible, for her not to be aware of these issues to some extent. As Maisha Wester writes, Shelley's youth and education coincided with the intensification of British abolitionist agitation to end the slave trade and, ultimately, slavery itself. By 1814, mass meetings and petitions over slavery were frequent, and slavery's implications for the rights of man registered in the consciousness of numerous writers, particularly women. Further, while there are no clear signs of their active involvement in the slavery debate, Mary and Percy Shelley, her husband, participated in at least one abolitionist protest by refusing to use sugar given its origins in the West Indies. So, not only is she aware of the ramifications of the slave trade, but the evidence we have shows she actively boycotted one of the trade's main exports. Shelley was engaged, then, in the very heated contemporary debate over race, the slave trade, and the emancipation of enslaved people who were predominantly black Africans, and these themes are everywhere in Frankenstein. Let's start with Victor and his aggressive, singular prejudice against the creature. What's notable is that Victor's prejudice is A, based almost entirely on how his creature looks, and B, starts from the very moment the creature is given life. Breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room. Victor goes on to describe the creature's physicality, othering him in a way that has strong racial overtones, and then makes this rather unpleasant statement. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endued with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then. But when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became such a thing as even Dante could not have conceived. So horrified is Victor that he is unable to greet, talk to, or reassure, or interact with the creature he has spent 2 years creating, all because he doesn't look right. And, by extension, because he doesn't look white. It's arguable that Victor's disgust is rooted in the notion that the beautiful human ideal is tied to a white European identity. As Ali Ratansi explains, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was an association between blackness and ugliness, and between beauty and moral virtue. Aesthetics during this period was dominated by the assumption that the ideal form of all human beauty could be found in Greek and Roman art. The most influential historian of art in the 18th century, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, devised a scale of beauty that highlighted certain features of antique sculptures as the embodiment of beauty. Winckelmann regarded the depressed nose as particularly ugly. The African could not but fall foul of this European ideal of beauty and moral worth. Anything that pollutes this ideal, then, is considered lesser or other because it's a deformed version of that perfect white European identity. I think Shelley is aware of these stereotypes and is incorporating them into Frankenstein. The creature is, therefore, immediately othered and dehumanised by Victor, a pattern that repeats itself throughout the novel anytime he interacts with people. As Zora T. Sullivan argues, the monster's deformity poses the colonial question of racial difference and is a cultural reminder of 19th century anxieties about the proximity and fluidity of racial otherness. Through presenting the creature as sympathetic, as she does with particular emphasis when we read the creature's own sorrowful testimony, Shelley is consciously engaging with this question and challenging those anxieties and prejudices. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Frankenstein presents an unproblematic depiction of race by any stretch. One thing I'm learning as I research more into race and slavery in the early 19th century is that people's views were often more complex than we might like to think. There were numerous writers, for example, who were anti-slavery and/or confirmed abolitionists who still conveyed very clearly prejudiced racial stereotypes in their writing. Mary Shelley included, I think. The presentation of Safi, the young woman fleeing an oppressive Turkish Muslim regime who comes to live with the de Lacy family and ends up inadvertently teaching the creature to read, has been convincingly read as an Orientalist misrepresentation of Eastern cultures. Safi exists in the novel as a voiceless and dependent woman who is denied the means to represent her culture. It has also been convincingly argued that Shelley may well have held an ameliorist stance when it came to the question of emancipation, and that this view is at the heart of Frankenstein. Ameliorists argued for the gradual liberation of enslaved people, because to free everyone immediately risked black insurrection. This argument aside, an ameliorist view still effectively advocated for the continued enslavement of black people. If, for example, as Maisha Wester has argued, the creature is racially coded to align with contemporary stereotypes about blacks, the fact he murders Elizabeth, the pure, white, innocent woman, in a manner that has been repeatedly read as an act of sexual violence, reinforces certain baseless and biased stereotypes about black men prevalent in the early 19th century and which are unfortunately still prevalent today. White people feared black rebellion and insurrection, and when these things happened, the slaughter of innocents and assaults on white women were frequently marked as unthinkable acts. Indeed, the creature's promise to Victor, moments after Victor has destroyed the creature's would-be wife, highly suggests the sexual violence that was the most extreme fear aroused by both Gothic texts and black insurrection. I shall be with you on your wedding night. Shelley's characterisation of the creature and his thirst for violence and revenge can be interpreted as reinforcing racist fears and stereotypes. So it would be reductive and inaccurate to suggest Frankenstein is an airtight, anti-racist text, especially since we're reading it through an early 21st century lens, which is very different from an early 19th century one. However, at the same time, and with all that said, Frankenstein can also be read as an astute critique of slavery, anti-abolitionism, and British colonialism. And where does British colonialism begin? With white men going on a little quest. What is Frankenstein, if not a quest narrative? Well, lots of things, but let's focus on this idea of quest for a second. Now, a quest narrative is typically a story in which the protagonist works tirelessly towards a goal. The pursuit of this goal likely becomes their all-consuming passion, and they must face seemingly insurmountable obstacles along the way. And indeed, Victor's story fits this profile. He works tirelessly to bring his creature to life, and then to bring him down. But Frankenstein is a subversion of the quest narrative. Typically, the protagonist of a quest narrative will be a hero of sorts. Think of The Wizard of Oz, think of The Lord of the Rings. We've got a hero who strives to overcome obstacles, usually to effect positive change, for which they receive some kind of reward. But Victor Frankenstein is no hero. He is, in my humble opinion, primarily responsible for ruining or ending the lives of most of his friends and family members. What we have here is a protagonist whose aim or goal is to create a living being without regard for its welfare, safety, or actions. Victor is motivated by self-interest, satisfying his own curiosity, and achieving greatness. And he is not the only one. As I've previously outlined, Frankenstein is a narrative within a narrative within a narrative, and the outer shell of those narratives is the one told by Robert Walton. Now, Walton is an explorer. He's on an expedition to the North Pole when he spies the creature sledging across the ice and finds Victor in pursuit. Why is Walton out here? Well, in his words, he wants to bestow upon all mankind the inestimable benefit of discovering a passage near the pole. But he, like Victor, fails and puts lives at risk in pursuing his goals. He, like Victor, is arrogant and single-minded. He quickly forms a kinship with Victor, the brother of my heart, who, and this is important, was not, as the other traveller, that's the creature, seemed to be, a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but an European. This comparison alone highlights Walton's prejudice. The white European man is a brother, the other a savage. In criticism, Walton and Victor are often paralleled with each other, and I think it's clear why. Both ruthlessly ambitious, both explorer types who won't stop until they've achieved their goal, and both representative of what Cynthia Pond calls masculine humanity. Walton is overjoyed when he finally encounters someone like himself, a quester, and someone from his own class and race. From the beginning of Mary Shelley's novel, masculine humanity only recognises its own basis of gender, class, and race. The female, the socially inferior, and the non-European, these are excluded from the ideal and practice of generic humanity. Walton and Victor aren't inhumane, but the humanity they show is exclusionary. So right from the beginning of the novel, even before we get to Victor's narrative, Shelley is raising questions about prejudice. And through our introduction to Walton, out here leading the charge in a single-minded glory hunt that echoes narratives of 19th century colonial conquest, Shelley introduces her first imperial motif in the novel. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. As Jessica Hale argues, Walton's narrative recalls the mellifluous prose used by the travel writers of the day to romanticise the project of colonial expansion. And this is something Shelley's first readers would likely have picked up on. Walton's language mirrors the narrative of discovery, all too often peddled, even today, that attempts to repackage imperial conquest as exciting and necessary exploration. And this, I would argue, is part of a deliberate critique on Shelley's part. Neither Walton nor Victor find the glory they seek. Their toils are not rewarded. Victor is punished, and Walton, hopefully, learns something, goes home and stays put. This isn't a novel that valorises notions of empire building, colonial exploration, or conquest at any cost. Taking part in these activities leads to failure, loss, and ruin. Racial stereotyping, colonialism, and imperial motifs are threaded throughout Frankenstein. But what about slavery itself? Well, you don't have to look far to see that slavery, its repercussions and moral implications are everywhere in the novel, not least in the fascinating master-slave dynamic Shelley creates and subverts between Victor and the creature. Now, we might initially assume the creature and Victor occupy clearly defined roles in relation to one another. The creature is the other in the novel, the outcast, the character who is considered subhuman. Victor is the creator, the godlike figure, the master. But a straightforward dynamic with Victor in control and the creature in submission is not what we get in Frankenstein. In fact, at different points in the novel, it is Victor, in all his privilege, who calls himself slave. He fantasises about an accident befalling the creature which would put an end to my slavery forever. He reflects that through the whole period during which I was the slave of my creature, I allowed myself to be governed by the impulses of the moment. Victor suggests here that he is doubly enslaved to his creature and to his impulses. Despite having brought the creature into the world, he rarely seems to consider himself master. But if Victor is the slave, where does this leave the creature? Well, at points, the creature too considers himself a slave to his impulses. Reflecting on the murders he's committed, he says, I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. But fascinatingly, he never considers himself slave to Victor, and in fact, actively rejects that kind of slavery for himself. Shall I respect man when he contemns me? Let him live with me in the interchange of kindness, and instead of injury, I would bestow every benefit upon him with tears of gratitude at his acceptance. But that cannot be. The human senses are insurmountable barriers to our union. Yet mine shall not be the submission of abject slavery. I will revenge my injuries. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear. Here, we get to the ethical heart of the novel that readers and critics have discussed and debated for centuries. Who is responsible for the creature's actions? Should the creature himself be held solely responsible for the violence he enacts because he was the direct perpetrator? Should Victor be responsible because he created the creature, gave him no guidance, and rejected him from the hour of his birth? Or should society at large be held responsible for failing to look past their own prejudices and driving the creature to isolation and revenge? For me, it's a little bit of columns A, B, and C, but I mostly lay the blame at Victor's door. And it's kind of ironic that one of the significant changes Shelley made between the 1818 and 1831 editions of the novel was to make Victor less sympathetic. It's like, how much less sympathetic can he get? I'm not a fan, but what do you think? And does your answer change if you consider Frankenstein from a post-colonial perspective? Let me know in the comments below. Regardless, what we get at this point in the novel is the creature's direct rejection of abject slavery. In spite of his sorrowful situation and his rejection from human society, he will not submit. He decides instead to take action by forcing Victor into making him a female companion, and when Victor goes back on his word, he's not happy. Slave! I before reasoned with you, but you have proved yourself unworthy of my condescension. Remember that I have power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light of day will be hateful to you. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey! Victor plays God, plays master, giving and destroying life at will. The creature puts a decisive end to this, literally reversing the master-slave dynamic and refusing to submit to a father figure and, more broadly, to a society that rejects him so cruelly. Marie Mulvey-Roberts likens this passage directly to the power of the plantation master being appropriated by the mutinous slave. The slave becomes the master through necessary but violent uprising. But if this is what Shelley is suggesting, how are we supposed to interpret her meaning? By disrupting, then obliterating the perceived power imbalance between master and slave, what point is Shelley making? Maybe she's taking an ameliorist stance, suggesting that enslaved people must be liberated gradually to avoid extreme violence upon their former masters. Or perhaps the master-slave role reversal Shelley plays out in Frankenstein is a meditation on the idea that nobody is free until we're all free. Through showing how their fates are bound up with one another, and the way in which the depravity of the one corrupts the virtue of the other, is Shelley showing us that inequality is mutually destructive? Or is she suggesting that the situation is too far gone? That the question of slavery cannot be reconciled peaceably? Is this the overall point of the novel? If you treat people this badly for this long, there's no going back. Chaos and violence will inevitably ensue. I want to hone in on this last interpretation for a minute because I think it reinforces just how engaged Shelley was in the dialogue surrounding slavery in the early 1800s. Engaging with this question of reconciliation between slave and master is just one of the ways in which Frankenstein not only works as a depiction of slavery, but parallels and takes direct inspiration from narratives written by enslaved people, and one in particular. In 1797, Olude Equiano, writer, businessman and abolitionist, published his autobiography. In it, he put down details of his kidnapping from modern-day Nigeria, transportation to the Americas, subsequent enslavement and eventual freedom. Mary Shelley was probably aware of Equiano's autobiography, even though he died before she was born, not least because her mother wrote a review of the book in her 1790 Vindication of the Rights of Man. Now, throughout Equiano's narrative, he returns to a guiding Christian principle: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, otherwise known as the Golden Rule. We see it here, as he describes how black African families were torn apart on being bought and sold. On a signal given, as the beat of a drum, The buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make choice of that parcel they like best. Relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over, in the men's apartment, there were several brothers who, in the sale, were sold in different lots, and it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. "O ye nominal Christians! Might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery." Equiano uses the Golden Rule to plead with his readers and make them reflect on their hypocrisy as Christians. But he also finds in it a source of comfort and a guiding principle. My mind was hourly replete with inventions and thoughts of being freed, and, if possible, by honest and honourable means. For I always remembered the old adage, and I trust it has ever been my ruling principle, that honesty is the best policy, and likewise that other golden precept, to do unto all men as I would they should do unto me. Now, you might be thinking, Equiano's attitude here is a bit too peaceful to have inspired Frankenstein. If the creature represents the enslaved person seeking vengeance, Equiano seems to be adopting a more forgiving stance. But, arguably, it is precisely this that Frankenstein is responding to. Through enacting revenge and rejecting further attempts at peaceful resolution, the creature's actions are a deliberate subversion of Equiano's principles. Such Christian niceties, the creature and Shelley seem to suggest, are no longer working in face of the continuation of slavery even after the trade ended in 1807. Only the last resort of violent revolution is left. And this is but one of the ways Shelley's narrative takes inspiration from and works in conversation with Equiano's. From the tropes of abandonment, escape and exile, to a shared structure, rhetoric, diction and syntax, Frankenstein adopts the model of the slave narrative. And not just Equiano's. As Grant Matthew Jenkins writes, writing by former slaves of African descent literally provided raw material for Shelley's imagination as it stitched together Frankenstein's textual fabric. It's arguable then that not only is Shelley criticising certain forms of racial prejudice, colonial expansion and slavery, but she is looking to slave narratives, to the testimonies of people who suffered under the slave trade to build her novel. Now, again, this doesn't mean Frankenstein presents an unproblematic view of race. In fact, to an extent, knowing this complicates the novel's relationship with slavery further. Is Shelley speaking for enslaved people in a way that further silences them? Does her borrowing from slave narratives, as Mulvey Roberts tells us, come to read as a textual patchwork of abolitionist writing and pro-slavery propaganda, a text that is, like its creature, very much a stitching together of a variety of views and ideas, many of which seem in conflict with each other? How we, as readers, reckon with race and otherness in Frankenstein is challenging. Reading this novel through a post-colonial lens is a potentially conflicting and difficult thing to do. But that's all the more reason to do it. Divisive ideologies and attitudes surrounding slavery and abolition that were brought into vivid and horrifying focus by writers like Equiano, and which Shelley took inspiration from, didn't suddenly disappear with the passing of the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833. The question of insurrection, for example, of rioting and violence as a means of effecting change, was taken up prominently by Martin Luther King Jr. 150 years after Frankenstein was published.
I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years.
Though King is speaking in a post-slavery context, the legacies of slavery are very prominent in what he's saying. And even today, in the 21st century, decades after King, we're still debating violent versus peaceful resistance to racial oppression. And this becomes incredibly important if we read Frankenstein in a post-colonial context. So, to return to the question we were considering at the start of the video, what can Frankenstein teach us about prejudice? An astonishing amount, I think. And a lot more than these stupid articles give it credit for. Shelley's incredibly complex and perhaps experimental depiction of race, slavery and victimhood, and of gender for that matter, is very difficult to reckon with as a reader. Frankenstein is a complicated novel to interpret, And it's the kind of text that has been the subject of countless different and conflicting readings over the years. And this is one of the reasons the novel is so enduring in our cultural consciousness. Shelley fires up her readers' imaginations, presents them with a series of ethical conundrums, raises issues of gender and race, all through the spectre of the other. A character within the story that is rooted in the creature, but becomes bigger, more abstract, more confounding the more you read. If we can say one thing for certain, it's that Frankenstein doesn't resolve the other. Literally, the last thing we see in the novel is the creature and all he has come to represent, borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. The spectre is at large, and we as readers are left to reckon with that, with how we treat difference, with our own hypocrisy, our own prejudice, and our very human and very inhumane capacity to other. But what do you think? I'd be really interested to hear whether you agree with my reading of Frankenstein or whether you have a totally different interpretation. Let me know in the comments below. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a Gothic classic. But what is the Gothic? And why do we so enjoy scaring ourselves through the media we consume? Find out by watching this next.